text this morning is from the book of Romans, chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, and 13 through 17. So what are we going to say? Are we going to find that Abraham is our ancestor on the basis of genealogy? Because if Abraham was made righteous because of his actions, he would have had a reason to brag, but not in front of God. What does the scripture say? Abraham had faith in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Workers' salaries aren't credited to them on the basis of an employer's grace, but rather on the basis of what they deserve. But faith is credited as righteousness to those who don't work, because they have faith in God who makes the ungodly righteous. The promise to Abraham and to his descendants that he would inherit the world didn't come through the law, but through the righteousness that comes through faith. If they inherit because of the law, then faith has no effect, and the promise has been canceled. The law brings about wrath, but when there isn't any law, there isn't any violation of the law. That's why the inheritance comes through faith, so that it will be on the basis of God's grace. In that way, the promise is secure for all of Abraham's descendants, not just those who are related by law, but also for those who are related by the faith of Abraham, who is the father of all of us. As it is written, I have appointed you to be father of many nations. So Abraham is our father in the eyes of God, in whom he had faith, the God who gives life to the dead and calls things that don't exist into existence. So Paul is writing to mostly Jewish audience living in Rome. Paul had never been to Rome. He didn't know his audience personally, but he had longed to go there. And there's a fundamental question that comes up very early in the life of the church. As Gentiles start hearing Jesus' message and start following Jesus' teachings and start coming into the church, what does this mean for the law? Right? Paul was a Pharisee. He studied the law day and night. He would have had it memorized. He lived by those commandments. So what does it mean now that there are these Gentiles coming to follow Jesus? They don't know the law. They haven't followed the commandments. They don't keep kosher in their food. They don't have Sabbath practices that are ingrained in them. So what do we do with them? What does it mean for the law? And the first big fight recorded in Acts, the first council of the church, is dealing with this question. You had one group called the Judaizers who said, well, in order to follow Jesus, you must first become Jewish and convert. You must first follow the law. And then you can follow Jesus. That was one side. Others said, no, whoever God calls to follow Jesus, God calls. Who are we to say that they have to do something first? Well, fortunately for all of us, especially the males in the room, the Judaizers did not win. Paul and Peter kind of duked it out in the conference, in the get-together there, and they all agreed that all those Gentiles coming into the church were in the right place. God was calling them into the church. So it left this question, what does that mean for the law? And Paul does a lot of writing about this question. So in our text today, he's going back pre-law to Abraham. Remember, God called Abraham. You heard Nancy read it in the Genesis reading. God calls Abraham out of his homeland and says, go where I tell you to go. Leave all of this. Leave your father's house. Leave your father's land. Go where I tell you to go. And he does it. There's no law. None of that exists. None of the commandments exist. And yet, a promise is made to Abraham. It starts as Abram, then it becomes Abraham. That's very confusing. And if you remember that promise, he brings him out of his tent, he has him look up at the sky, and he says, your descendants will be more numerous than the stars in the sky. Your descendants will be more numerous than the grains of sand on a beach. So incalculable. You won't be able to count them, they're so vast. That is the first promise, or the first covenant between God and the people, given to Abraham before the law. Now you get to Paul's day and age, and the law is so ingrained in Jewish life, they can't envision anything but the law. While they would know their lineage and their history, and they would understand that the law was given, 400 to 800 years after Abraham, they can't envision Jewish life apart from the law. It was so ingrained in them. It was all that guided every action that they had in a day. But now all of that is in upheaval because you have all these people coming in following Jesus who don't follow the law. So what was the law's purpose? What was the law's purpose? Why was it given? Was it given so that we could be made righteous? This is what Paul's talking about here. By following the commandments, by going through this day in and day out to keep the law and keep it holy, does that bring about our righteousness? Does that make us holy in God's eyes? Does that make us acceptable in God's eyes? Is that how that works? And I think, based on Paul's writings, we can kind of deduce that that was ingrained in the understanding, right? By keeping the commandments, by doing this religiously, pun intended, you were gaining God's favor. You were becoming righteous in God's eyes. You were being set apart as holy. And I think Paul probably believed that. A lot of Paul's writings are him struggling with his past and trying to grapple with what it means now. And you can kind of see a progression in his writings about that. But Paul says, no. It was never about that. Because if it is, then I have the right to brag. Look at how righteous I am. Look at how holy I am. I have done this thing by keeping the commands. I have done this thing by being obedient to God. I have done this. I am worthy of praise. And it can't be that. Because then we can brag and be proud. And Paul's pretty clear about the bragging and the proudness. It has to be a gift. The only way it works and makes sense is if it is a gift freely given by God to us. It's nothing we can earn. It's nothing we can boast about. It's nothing we can be proud about. Because following the law never led to righteousness. Because Abraham was deemed righteous prior to the law because God chose him and made him righteous. He didn't do anything for it. He didn't earn it. He was called righteous because God made him righteous. We too are called holy and righteous because God makes us that way. Not because we're better than other people, or we're doing more, or we're doing it better, or we're more obedient. We're less sinful. Whatever language you want to use with it, that has nothing to do with our righteousness. It's only a gift given to us. Does that mean the law has no value? No. Remember, the law was given to provide parameters for a community of how to live together. And more specifically, how to live together when someone violates somebody else. What do you do? How do you maintain community with others when there has been a violation of trust? Or there has been an action that has harmed another person? Because communities need rules. Anarchy doesn't work for community. Rules always emerge. But who's the author of the rules? That's the question. Who's the author of the rules, and who do the rules benefit? Because as the law was given, the rules were to benefit those who were most susceptible to harm. But over time that changed. It got warped and it changed, and it benefited those in power. That's the scene that Jesus walks into. Those in power were benefiting from the law because they were creating the parameters of what it meant to keep the law, to be holy, to be pure, to be righteous. And if you didn't fit their definition of those things, you were cast out, removed from Jewish society, which made it impossible to practice your faith. You couldn't go to the temple. You couldn't offer your sacrifices. You couldn't shop at the markets. You had to shop the pagan markets where things are not kosher. So what Paul is writing about and what Paul is seeing is a writing of what had become wrong. Again, Jesus' teaching was what? How do you protect the least of these? How do you serve the least of these? How do you live a life where you set aside your own wants and desires in service of others? He taught it in the Sermon on the Mount. He taught it in the Great Commandment. He taught it in parables over and over and over and over again, consistently through his whole ministry. How do we reset what it means to be community? How do we reset the rules and who benefits from the rules? This goes all the way back to when the law was given. This year of Jubilee they were to celebrate. What was the year of Jubilee? Every 50th year, everything was reset. All debts were forgiven. Land that had been transacted between families go back to the original owners. Everything is reset to zero every 50 years. Because I think God understood that things will become imbalanced. Product of the human fall, things become imbalanced. They never celebrated a year of Jubilee. That's recorded, that we know about. Never happened. We start rationalizing and convincing ourselves, well, it doesn't really mean that. Forgive debts? What? I've got money out there. I need it back. I bought that land. It's mine. I can't give it back. The world that Paul is writing about in Romans and his other letters is a world of upheaval. It is a world where everything we think is right, all of the practices we think have to be there, are flipped. That's the role of the church. To work towards building a world that is equitable, that is loving, that is kind, that is compassionate, that is forgiving. These are the marks of the kingdom. It's a tall order, and it can feel overwhelming, especially, every week it just seems like, well, that was a rough week. It can't get bad. Much worse than that. And it's like, oh, we're bombing Iran now. That's going to have some bad things happen because of it. It seems like an insurmountable thing to create a world like that. A world that Jesus taught us, a world that God structured, the world that God created us to live in. And yet, when we do it, when we follow that impulse, great things happen. Worlds are transformed. Lives are changed. But it's hard work. And it requires self-sacrifice. It always starts with self-sacrifice. We're real quick to point out to others what they should do different, or maybe ways we think they should sacrifice. I think you should do this. I think you should do that. That's avoiding the real focus. I've said it before, I'll say it again. When we read the Bible, when we study the Bible, it should only be a mirror that shines the light on ourselves and highlights the things we need to change. As soon as we start holding it up to others and saying, this is telling me how you need to change, we've gotten it wrong. It always starts with us. This is the second Sunday of Lent, 6 weeks of trying to calm ourselves, of quiet ourselves, listen more than we speak, take stock in what are the things that take up all of our time. What do we spend our money on? What are the things we need to change to realign ourselves with our calling? So be doing that work. Do the hard work of looking within, recognizing what needs to change, and trusting that God will transform it. And that because of that, we will all benefit. And we will work towards building the kingdom. Amen.